Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, where intent and impact drive the inquiry of our conversations. We've decided to do a compilation for you.
So hopefully this is an instructive episode of how we can navigate all the different intersections.
Absolutely. Hopefully, you will enjoy these. This is going to be a very interesting topic today because we're going to speak specifically to our region. However, this is happening across the globe, right? So, what we discuss today very possibly could be solutions to help the world, not just our particular area. And our topic today is food is medicine. And I know that you're just excited and can't wait to get into this particular topic.
Well, it's really near and dear to my heart. Food is medicine. Number one, I love to eat. Number two, I really believe in my professional career as a vascular surgeon, it really couldn't have been if folks were eating a really good diet, right? Like, so it's very interesting paradox to me that, a livelihood is created off people eating poorly.
Mm-hmm.
But then you got to peel that back, right? Like, and I don't say it to be critical, right? Like, I'm not criticizing people's dietary selections because I don't always know what their choices were. Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of today's show. Mm-hmm. The concept of food is medicine is broad because it takes us everywhere from people not having access to food to eat to eating healthy and all the benefits of that, and really everything in between. But I want to set the context by talking about North Carolina. So if you looked at North Carolina's GDP and put it on a world stage, North Carolina would be ranked number 30 in the world. And the strength of our economy is agriculture. So this global level state economy based on agriculture, yet we have a 20% childhood food insecurity rate across our state on average. That's a paradox that's hard for me to reconcile, right? Like 20% of the kids in our state don't get enough to eat on a day-to-day basis, or have some, and adults are not immune either, particularly when you get into elderly populations and isolated populations. But that's amazing.
Mm-hmm. It really and truly is amazing because a multitude of things run through my head, right? Having grown up in Wilmington, if I examine Wilmington now, I take a look at where grocery stores are and where they're not, right? And I ask myself, how did that happen, right? So I go to policy, whether it's local government policy, whether it's the company who decided to build their grocery store in a particular area versus another area, right? But it all comes down to policy and those people who make the policy. But at the end of the day, it's the consumer or the families that are impacted because the healthy food is just not available to some people and it's available to others, right? And so we talk about food being the medicine and you being a physician. If we ate properly, we probably wouldn't have to see the physician as often as we actually do. And I did a little bit of research on that whole phrase, quote, food is medicine. So I really wanted to find out where that originated because so many people talk about how it originated with Hippocrates, right? But in my research, I found a little bit something different that actually is attributed to a gentleman who was an ancient Egyptian named Imhotep. And this was written in the Edwin Smith Papyrus book, written over 3,500 years ago, and actually was 1,000 years before Hippocrates was born, that Imhotep made that statement that food is medicine. And I wanted to do the research because we did we did a episode on the whole truth, right? And so we need to understand the origins of where the whole truth come from. And I know people have to understand that let food be your medicine, and how we're going to address that whole truth, and how we're going to address food deserts in this area and hopefully across the globe.
Yeah, it definitely didn't start with a Twitter hashtag, right? Although you see it a lot now.
Right,
And
right,
I think it does help bring awareness, right? So the power of social media to bring awareness. And we used the hashtag food is medicine a lot in the capital campaign for the food bank of Central and Eastern North Carolina. Raised many millions of dollars for that new building and everything. But the truth is that food is medicine. And I can tell you, as a person who made a living as a vascular surgeon, there are only a very few health behavioral changes that we need that really would fundamentally change everything. One of those is certainly food, and how we handle our relationship with food, not only the amounts we eat, but what we eat. And then the others, really would be smoking and exercise. But if those things were in place, nobody'd need a vascular surgeon. I mean, very few, right? Health would be incredibly better, particularly diabetes, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I continue to be struck by people just fundamentally not having enough to eat, especially children. And we have multiple nonprofit organizations just in our small town, but we know it's across the country, that are working on this problem of not enough food to eat. So how's a child supposed to learn in school? How are they supposed to behave in school if they're literally starving to death during class? How do we compensate for that phenomenon? How do we recognize it? How do we measure it? How do we know if we're on track to fix it? But one question that never comes up for me anymore, but I hear a lot, is how much more do we need to prove before we start really taking massive action around this problem of food insecurity?
Absolutely. I never would have thought that in 2022, in the United States of America, that we'd be talking about food deserts and food insecurity. I remember the first time I ever heard the phrase food insecurity, and I really didn't know what it meant. It was probably 2011. I traveled to Washington, D.C., to the Liberian embassy, and I was given a presentation. And a gentleman started talking about food insecurity. And I thought he was talking about security, like security guards guarding food, because people in Liberia would, try to break in and get the food. And then he started talking about the pricing of food on the world market. And he made a very profound statement that really stuck with me. And his statement was, I just want to be able to wake up in the morning and know that my children can eat because there's food in the refrigerator. And it really didn't hit me. And then I come back to Wilmington, and I'm beginning to hear all this conversation around food deserts. And then I look across the country, and there are food deserts, right? And I'm like, wow, this is a serious issue. And I'm trying to understand how, in the wealthiest nation in the world, that we have an issue with people getting something healthy to eat, especially with the food that's thrown away by some of these major grocery stores. So I know you're going to get more into that, because I know that this is a part of your purpose as well as you're passionate about it.
Well, it gets to the definition of food desert, right? So in North Carolina, and the way we've chosen to define it in the dashboard, the Healthy Communities NC dashboard, is a food desert in a rural area would be a place where it's more than 10 miles to a food source, and in an urban setting, that'd be 1 mile. Has to do with transportation patterns and what it takes to actually get access to the food and so forth. And we know in Wilmington that we've actually experienced some expansion of food deserts. We know that COVID made things worse. But a lot of it is stable. So you take Wilmington's north side, where we're sitting right now, and it's been 30 years. since a grocery store was here. Now, fortunately, after a number of years of focused work, and we really started this in the health system in 2017, looking at the concept of food as medicine, looking at food deserts, focusing on food for our patients as well as our community. Now 5 years later, we know that there actually is going to be a Northside Food Co-op just a few blocks from where we sit. First one in 30 plus years. And that's a collaborative partnership with many stakeholders, including our government, the New Hanover County government. So we're on the right trajectory in this particular community, but we have to continue to maintain vigilance about what's happening, because as patterns change, the food desert can just move around.
That's right.
Based on the particular pattern that you're facing. And so we have to stick with that, because the benefits of healthy eating cannot possibly be overstated.
It's very interesting because I know probably over the last 4 to 5 years, there probably have been 5 or 6 different grocery stores that have come into the Wilmington area. You look at Lidl, you look at Aldi, and you look at Publix that's open a couple of locations. But as they've entered this area, not one has built a store in what we consider to be a food desert, which is quite interesting. That 4 to 5 grocery stores would come to this area, but not, and of course their obligations to their stakeholders, right? And that is to make a profit. But we can make that profit and be social and empathetic at the same time, right? Social, I guess you would call it social capitalism. But not one of those grocery stores made it to the food desert, to the north side. And that was just quite interesting for me.
Yeah, me too. And I don't pretend to understand the business model of food chains and grocery stores and everything, but I certainly understand that there are likely to be policy options that could be exerted to help make sure that these profitable entities participate in solving the problem across the whole community, yes. Right? So not just come in and take out based on their model of commerce, but be a member of the community, participate. And we know that works because one of our great partners in this whole battle against food insecurity has been Food Lion, right? So Food Lion actually has been a partner with us in food insecurity the whole time. And that's kind of what it takes to solve it.
Yeah, I would agree. It takes collaboration, co-creation, right? New ideas, curiosity. How can we take an existing model, modify that model, and make it a model such that we can utilize in different areas, right? And it could have taken a conversation around Publix coming to town, because people knew they were coming to town. How can we modify that model, whether it's a smaller version of a Publix store, a smaller version of a Lidl or an Aldi? And I know that when I name those particular, they have a demographic they want to appeal to, right? And so I understand that. But again, when we're talking about human beings and we're talking about healthy food, I would like to think that some of those models could be, and we don't control that, could be modified such that everybody can benefit.
Well, in the world where you have Amazon's doing drone deliveries and partnership, their ownership of Whole Foods and different things like that, it really does open up new opportunities in terms of what the brick and mortar infrastructure might need to look like in a given community, and how that food may be able to be delivered in different ways. But the point is that we need to acknowledge that it's not a uniform situation. And I want to get our engineer to point to the food hardship index in the region slide as we go through this next little bit, and put that on, because what you see is that you're going to see that in New Hanover County, the smallest geographic county in North Carolina, we have food indexes that range from the highest hardship index, which is 1.0. That's the highest you can get. It's like
Wow.
making 100 on a test,
Wow.
to 0. And we have everything in between across those communities. And you can look at this map that you see on your screen, and you can see by color what the level of hardship is. And as we go through different episodes on different economic hardships, one thing you're going to see is that there's a lot of similarity between communities. So you see what's reflected based on concentrated poverty. And so, for instance, New Hanover Tract 110, which has the highest hardship index for food, also has similar findings in terms of housing stress and many other factors. And it just so happens that that census tract is going to be served now by one of the new Michael Jordan Family Medical Clinics of Novant Health's being right in that census tract. That is going to help actually eliminate that food desert, because just 4 blocks from that clinic and really inside a mile from these communities is going to be the fresh food market that's part of Food Bank of Central and Eastern North Carolina's new building on Greenfield Street. Yeah. So we sort of start working on problems together, right? We bring access to health care to a neighborhood that doesn't have it. We bring access to food to the same neighborhood that doesn't have it, and on about all these other factors.
Yeah, that's going to produce a lot of fruit in that area.
Pardon the pun, right?
Yeah, that's right. You got the healthcare and now the food, right? And so, as we say, food is medicine. So that's going to produce a lot of fruit, a lot of great outcomes in that area. And now, as you mentioned, based upon where we're sitting, the fact that there will be a food co-op coming this way, that'll produce even more fruit. So what we have to do is begin to transform the minds of the people around how they eat and what they eat. I'm just as guilty, From time to time, I just got to have that 2-piece white meat, French fries, and a large sweet tea, right? When I probably should be doing a salad with some grilled chicken or something, right? So not that we are perfect, but the fact that we are aware, making people aware of how food serves as medicine. One of the things I mention to certain people on a regular is when you're eating, you're really eating for nutritional value. What's the nutrition in what you're eating, right? Some people may go to fast food and you ask yourself, so what's the nutrition? Are you getting cellular nutrition when you eat that particular food? Or if you're eating certain food and you're not getting any nutritional value, all you're getting is filler, so you feel full, but from a nutritional perspective, you're not getting anything. And I think that's a part of the whole educational process, right, of food being medicine, and you can elaborate more on that.
Absolutely. You're talking about, empty calories versus calories that contain all the necessary nutrients and everything. And I got to tell the story of how this whole picture can come together sometimes, right? So one of the things that happened in 2017 with our health system is that we really started looking at the concept of food insecurity and its connection to malnutrition. And we were really thinking through, so how do we identify people in the first place that are either malnourished or don't have enough to eat? And so we thought, okay, captive environment, right? So our hospital is a captive environment, right? So we can ask questions that help us know, as just a part of the normal intake of any patient who gets admitted to our hospital. And if those 2 simple questions are suggestive, then a more thorough diagnosis can be made. And, we found out we have a significant malnutrition problem amongst hospitalized patients. And we said, well, we know that that's bad because they won't recover from their illness as well. They'll stay in the hospital more. They'll get readmitted more after discharge because their needs are not being met. The nutritional needs to heal whatever disease process or surgery that they had is not what it needs to be. And so we tapped into subject matter expert, our registered dietitians. And they started a malnutrition program, and the results were incredible. Number one, our accuracy in diagnosing malnutrition based on the program that our dietitians established went up by 1,500%. So we were better at diagnosing it, right? Our readmission rate went down by 26% for these patients that were treated. That by itself is amazing, but the truth is we were given safer and better care. And then we began to realize, well, there are lots of gaps in that continuum of care that we really don't understand. What really is going on in the homes, and how do we give some of these patients the best opportunity for success? And so we did a pilot that was grant funded out of the Duke Endowment, and had a community dietitian on our staff. And that community dietitian for these patients that were screened positive would go into the home, help them navigate what to eat, how to eat it, and also get a little bit of a home assessment on other health-related features to plug into other different home-based services that we had. But it was truly amazing. So this became an anchor of a strategy for how you take care of people where they are in the home, right? And the results were amazing, as I said before, what the changes in outcomes were. But that was just for that one group of patients that was malnourished at the time of their acute illness. So we said, well, what does the rest of the continuum look like, right? And so we began to screen for those questions in our outpatient clinics, right? And find out, okay, well, these patients are at risk for not having enough to eat, or their families are. And we began to partner with Food Lion and Food Bank to have food box prescriptions. So these patients who would come into the clinic would be assessed for food security. And if they had needs, they would get a 2-week prescription for food that came in a box. And that was the bridge to connect them to other services that are already in existence for how they would then stabilize their food supply. And not just something to eat. You know, these boxes got tailored by our dietitians to be healthy sources of food. And so you see how we really began to change the curve. But that wasn't the only thing, because the malnutrition quality improvements that we achieved were noticed. I'm Dr. Philip Brown with my good friend Terry Jackson, and we are so excited today to have a special guest, Dr. Umbereen Nehal. Umbereen, I would love for you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself, with a takeaway of, if there were maybe three things the audience should know about you before we get started, what would they be?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I love the intro about how you can control the trajectory of your day as well as your life. It's great. I describe myself as a human ping pong ball. So when people ask me about, home, or actually even honestly, if they ask me about, what's your name, I'm just like, well, how much time do you have? In that, actually, my name typically would be spelled Ambreen, but my mother spelled it a bit differently. So even that becomes a conversation point. But so I've lived in multiple countries. I was born in the US to immigrant parents from Pakistan. Although if you trace our history, we're mutts, so I'm a mutt and I'm a ping pong ball. And, went to medical school in Pakistan, actually, despite having, started college in the US, and lived in Saudi Arabia, where my dad had a job with an oil company, and traveled in Europe. So I like to, but I think what that's allowed me to do is, we hear a lot about empathy, but I'm a bit of a critic of empathy along the lines of Paul Bloom from Yale, a professor who says that, maybe we should have more rational compassion. So maybe that's the second thing I would say about me, is I like to be both compassionate and rational. And I think there's an innate tension sometimes between the heart and the head, and we need to find that, again, intersection between those two. And the third thing is I like to snowshoe.
Mm.
I think there's a funny Winnie the Pooh, I think, quote that like when you see somebody putting on their boots, you know they're going on an adventure. And when I put on my snowshoes, even if I'm just going down a pretty sedate path in a park, it feels like you're going on an adventure.
That is brilliant. I'm glad to know that about you. It really just underscores, because you and I spent a little bit of time together recently online,
Mhm.
and that's another thing I didn't know. So it's fantastic to enrich those relationships. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how workplace diversity makes it possible to deliver equitable care, but really coming at it from a different angle, which was your idea,
Mhm.
and I think is a very powerful one. And so just talking about the whole concept of intersectionality, and I think maybe a good place to start for our audience might be to define that a little bit for them.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So I think there's aspects of identity that are visual, right? So somebody can look at me and say that I appear to be female. I appear to be, some people can right away tell that I'm South Asian. Some people can be like, she's something, she's something. She could maybe be white, but not really, right? And there's a concept of like being white passing or white adjacent. So, but then there's so many other dimensions. We're essentially, even in terms of when I coach people on communication, this is something I've been learning because you've probably already noticed I like to use a lot of words, and we are essentially like diamonds, right? And we have multiple facets. And when you look at a diamond, you see its brilliance, but you can't appreciate every individual facet.
Mm.
So as humans, there are many, many, and if you were to try to actually see all of the facets cut into a diamond, it would take too long and it's impossible. And you would probably feel like you kind of go a little crazy. And I don't mean to be ableist, but it would just make your brain unhappy, right? So when you communicate, you have to choose, just like you said, tell me three things about yourself. You have to choose what parts you present. And there's a book, even though it's a little pejorative in the title, like Surrounded by Idiots, that implies that when you try to communicate with somebody and they don't get it, you're just like, what's wrong with them? In fact, it's not that they're an idiot or there's anything wrong with them. Again, not to be pejorative, but that's the book's title. It's rather that you may be choosing to display a facet that they're not really ready to receive, or they don't have the bandwidth to receive, or they don't have the lived experience to understand.
Mm.
And the lived experience part of it is what's important with intersectionality, because there are facets of you, there are domains of your personality that may not be obvious. So when you look at me, you wouldn't automatically know that I have endometriosis, which is something that affects 1 in 10 women.
Mm.
And most people have probably walked into a room and not realized that 1 in 10 women at least has endometriosis. And that affects your life. It affects many things. There are things that you do have control over, like you said, about the trajectory of your day and your life, and there are things you don't have control over. So like that's an example that while, on the surface, I'm a physician, my background tells you that I'm at MIT. You can, see that I appear to be female and South Asian. There's all these other aspects of me that you may not know. That I have probably a different brain. I don't test positive for any particular this or that when I've been neurocognitive tested, just out of curiosity. But I have a different brain. And so like I like to say that so as a scientist, we talk about statistics, and like 2 standard deviations from the mean is you cross the line into abnormal. So I like to think that I'm 1.8 standard deviations from the mean. And I'm an outlier, like
Mm-hmm. Malcolm
um
Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell. Yes.
exactly, thank you. So I'm an outlier.
That's interesting because you've said a great deal from the very beginning of the introduction of yourself in the 3 points, right? And so
Mm.
I heard empathy, and I remember reading a book, Compassionomics.
Mm.
And in Compassionomics, I think he talked about compassion is empathy in motion, right?
Mm.
and then I heard Pakistan, which I've had the pleasure of visiting, and actually
Wow.
doing some leadership training in Pakistan through the U.S. Embassy. And I heard oil company, which I worked for, Mobil Oil, in the past. But I think this whole piece of what you just described was the iceberg, right? The iceberg of maybe there's 15% of the iceberg above the water with 85% below the water. When we deal with, when we see people and they come in the room, that's why we like to get to the root of being human.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be human? And I guess I'll ask that question of you. We were talking about intersectionality, because even at every intersection, what we're dealing with is a human being,
Correct.
right? So, what does it mean to you to be human?
That's a good question. Very philosophic. Um, I will say I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Because I think that I will also say, just to touch upon some less butterfly unicorn type of stuff, is I've worked in the pediatric emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
So I've also seen the underbelly of humanity,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. I think we are deeply flawed. And I think we aspire to be more than that. And I think there is, well, so my faith background is I'm Muslim, I'm
Mm-hmm.
Islam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know the word jihad is negative, has a negative connotation in how some people misinterpret it,
Mm-hmm.
including Muslim people. But there's a concept of a daily jihad,
Mm-hmm.
which to me actually maps to the introduction of this that we started with, that you have choices. Every moment, every day you have choices. And the jihad is just a struggle.
Right.
There's a concept of the nafs, or your desire, right? And then, or even like if you look at psychology, there's the part of your brain that controls your breathing that you can't control. If you try to stop breathing, your body will take control, be like, you got to breathe. Right. Then there's your limbic system, which controls anger and, your more nether kind of desires and whatnot. Right. And that is essential for your survival as an individual. So for fight or flight, or survival of the species. So like sexual desire. And then there's your cognition, which is your higher brain. Right. And those are kind of in struggle, and they're in balance. And so to me, jihad is sort of like, do I have the piece of chocolate? Or
Yes. Yes.
do I have the struggle?
Yes. Yes.
If it's dark chocolate, is it okay? Because it's good for you.
Yes. 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 Yes.
And now is my cognition kind of like coming to play with my desire, being like constructing a narrative that makes me feel good about myself?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I holding myself accountable to a higher standard? Right. So I think that, so maybe that's the answer to being human. Being human, hopefully, is to aspire to something greater than what you are. And to hopefully we have the strength of character to understand that we're flawed, and to not perceive that as weakness, but rather an opportunity to improve.
That's right.
So you said something earlier that really struck a chord with me as a surgeon, because you talked about this compassionate rationalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love for you to explore that thought process a little bit more, because it truly resonates with me as a surgeon, because so many of the times that's exactly the space you find yourself in with patient care.
100%. And in fact, actually, so as you know, Doc Brown, I'm actually 3 months out from having had a surgery myself for endometriosis and fibroids, which is very common. And this, again, I think is another intersectionality issue, that while my appearance and where I've gone to school and the way I speak tends to kind of place me more what we call white adjacent, the issues that I had, like for instance, fibroids, is something that affects a lot of Black women. And now that I've at midlife experience things that affects, more Black women. And this is where empathy needs to be also have a rationality to it. Because now that my own lived experience matches more that of a classic woman of color or Black woman, and I had to have a conversation with surgeons about, do I have a hysterectomy? And by the way, a hysterectomy affects 1 in 3 women in the United States. If this were affecting, and maybe this will be seen political and the way I'm saying it, but I have to ask, if this were affecting 1 in 3 white men, would we be amputating body parts? Right? So do you have to have the lived experience in order to have the compassion? But I don't think so, actually, because I would say, so to your point about as a surgeon, I feel like I got, and the woman who did my surgery was excellent, and I trusted her with my body and my health. That said, I will say that some of the best advice I've gotten are from white male surgeons on something that is typically a woman of color disease. And I feel like sometimes they are able to step back and not feel your feels with you in a way that allows them to have full access to their cognition without their limbic system, or what's called the lizard brain, or your threat center, activated. So I actually push back on those women who perceive that you can only go to a female doctor or a female provider, or, you have to share my experience before you can deliver good care to me. Because I do believe that you can be committed to problem solving and a good result. Perhaps if you are not experiencing the same trauma of being a woman in the healthcare system, perhaps you have more energy and problem solving ability to focus on getting to the solution. And that could be, for instance, the, equipoise, or the a little bit of clinical distance. So now we talk so much about empathy. But again, Paul Bloom actually points out that if you're feeling the feels with the patient, you might actually be too much in a space of trauma, or too much of a space of emotion, to activate the full ability of your data-driven cognition to really think about all the options. So I do find, like, for instance, some women surgeons, and this is not a criticism, this is merely an observation, themselves are so traumatized by what it is to have a uterus, first menstruation, then fibroids, then surgery. It's a lot of trauma. They're just like, oh my God, get it out. Just be done with it. Right? But then I think about it, I'm just like, well, let's just think logically for a second. Have either of you ever installed a big TV or a wall unit or anything in your house?
Yes. Yes.
Didn't you have to secure it really well? Right? So it doesn't fall on somebody?
Yes, absolutely.
Like, what is the purpose of a uterus? Granted, I have not used my uterus for biologic purposes, but it can hold up to a 14-pound fetus, right? Maybe even more. I mean, most fetuses are not that big, but they can get that big. Now think about, the body has to secure that organ with a lot of ligaments. That body has to provide, your body has to provide a lot of blood supply to grow an entire another human in there, and has nerves to contract, right? Now you're going to cut all of that when you amputate that organ, and you're going to tell me it has no long-term effects on my health, no long-term effects on my pelvic floor function, right? And so this is where I actually find that, when we talk about equity and diversity in healthcare, and we talk about increasing, women or minorities in healthcare, is it possible that because of how much we put onto these individuals, that you are the solution to these systemic problems? It's all you, go be a hero. Right? Is that really realistic? And are we putting undue pressure on these? Like, it reminds me of that scene from Wonder Woman in the No Man's Land scene, where they're in the trenches, and the guys are just like, we can't stop for everybody. We got to move on. right? And she's like, no, I won't tolerate that. And she like climbs out of the trenches, and she just personally by herself goes onto the battlefield, and she's like deflecting bullets one by one with her, by the way, magical cuffs, which I don't have. You know, by the way, with her shield given to her by her father, Zeus, who's a god. And my dad is excellent, but he's not a god, by the way. And you're going to tell me, hey, Dr. Nehal, Umbereen, go onto the battlefield by yourself because you're a strong woman of color. You can do it. You don't got no shield or cuffs, but you can do it. Right. And then what does that do to me psychologically when you're telling society is telling me like, you're strong, you're smart, you can do it by yourself. Go save all the women of color out there. Am I actually then however you pumped me up while not providing me with the actual needed resources, am I going to deliver excellent care? Or actually is a white male surgeon who, when he says do this, it gets done, who is senior, and you know this, Doc Brown, you're a surgeon who's maybe the most senior in the hospital, therefore has the most access to OR time. Well, I maybe get the safest care with him. He's not personally feeling my feels, and he has access to the resources to get me, you know, if I have an emergent something, he's got the OR time, he gets it done, right? And this is not a popular opinion, but this is a reality. And the reason I'm stating it is because it's not that I'm not as good as you, Doc Brown. I think I'm at least as good as you. But I also know that I'm human. I also know that I'm flawed, and if I'm really tired, it's possible I could make an error, and I should be aware of that. And to expect me to be a hero and not provide me the resources, and for me to provide for all women of color, is not fair, is not realistic, it's not safe. And I think that's where the rational compassion also comes in, right? Where you have to be able to say, so I could, out of ego, be like, I want to be the hero. Yes, that's me. Right? But if you have more a rational approach, you'd say, okay, but what is the system that surrounds me? What are the resources that I have? What are the outcomes I'm expected to deliver? And if those outcomes are not perfect, I don't take it personally like, oh my gosh, you're saying that I, as a female surgeon, am not good enough. No. Okay. Actually, as it turns out, female surgeons have excellent outcomes, sometimes, better. But we need to be able to remove ourselves. And that's where empathy gets dangerous, right? Because even if you think about like empathy, like walk in somebody else's shoes, when you like grammatically, when you say walk in somebody's shoes, the I is silent. The subject of that sentence is I walk in somebody's shoes. I feel your feels. The subject of that sentence is me, not you. So empathy centers actually on me and my feelings. And if I don't have a matching experience to yours, and I can't believe that's where the not believing comes in. And so I do, though, believe that we can train people, including white male surgeons, to deliver excellent care to women of color if we don't center on the shared experience part, but saying, look, just like I'm flawed as a human being, we as flawed human beings create flawed science. Plus, if you're a real scientist, you understand that knowledge is infinite and we are finite. If you subtract something finite from infinity, you end up with infinity. There's an infinite amount of information we do not know. So as a scientist, you go into any situation saying, I only have a fraction of information. And so I shouldn't rely only on me and my knowledge. I shouldn't bring hubris into the OR. I shouldn't bring hubris into the exam room, right? I shouldn't bring hubris into clinical trials. I've kind of gone on for quite a bit, so I'll pause.
There's a whole lot that you said there, right? We're talking about something that is systemic.
Correct.
And in order to change that, then you're really talking about transformation and the examination of mental models. That's what you're
Hmm.
really talking about, right? So the challenge is how do we begin to, brick by brick, deconstruct and reconstruct mental models that makes us see each other more human and
Hmm.
understand that we are at these intersections daily.
Hmm.
And as we are at the intersection, we may need to pause and say, this is a human being that I'm actually dealing with. How do we reconstruct that type of narrative and reality or perceived reality such that we can treat patients better?
So I'm a pediatrician. So there's some really funny videos by Dr. Glaucome Flecken, I think he is, right? It may not be pronouncing it. He makes some really funny videos about different specialties. But there's a really funny one where the pediatrician goes to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is like, you need to spend more time around adults. And the pediatrician is like, why? So, and now that I'm in business school, I sometimes get feedback being like, she should have learned this already, right? Like, I think I haven't. Pediatricians basically are Peter Pans in some ways, and we don't want to grow up and deal with annoying adults. You two are pretty okay, though.
Well, thank you, thank you,
Well,
thank you.
appreciate that. I was fascinated by a lot of the discussion around the whole topic before with the surgeon and all that meant, the systemic issues, and it's interesting. I I had the opportunity to understand a little bit about the whole concept of endometriosis and hysterectomy. My wife went through that about,
Hmm.
gosh, seven. I mean, endometriosis, long time, but the hysterectomy part, I guess it's been almost 6.5, 7 years now. So that put me in a different space of understanding.
Hmm.
Like not the surgeon space, but the family space,
Sure.
and it's such a different thing. And one of the things I've always kind of tried to highlight as a paradox is, the physician is the authority on the medical condition, on the diagnosis, on the treatment possibilities, but the patient has authority in terms of decision rights of what's right for them, and how that process of co-creation comes together between patient and physician is so important to getting the right treatment. Right, the patient has to be informed adequately, which is challenged at best because so frequently, unlike in your case where you own the medical language because you are a physician, so that's
Hmm.
different conversations. A lot of times with patients, there's a language barrier there,
Yeah.
just in medical versus whatever their native language is. So expand a little bit on that whole idea of what that intersection looks like and
Hmm.
how it gets successfully navigated to a good treatment plan.
Absolutely. So first, I think I actually didn't finish answering the other question. The quick answer to how do you deconstruct it is to have the beginner's mind or the child mind, right? And to have that growth mindset. And I think that a lot of the challenges that come into play when we get is coming from being too stiff and too adult, perhaps,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And having this built up ego and not wanting to acknowledge that you've done anything wrong. And it's a perception, it's a very moralistic attitude of right versus wrong, as opposed to believing we're all inherently flawed. There's an infinite amount of knowledge that we can never know, that it, expands throughout the universe. And so we need to approach things with curiosity and humility,
Hmm.
and to be under. And so whenever somebody corrects you, it's not a correction, it's just learning. And I will say, having been in the diversity spaces, there are times when somebody of a more marginalized identity than mine will say, no, I'm correcting you. And you can feel it, right? There's a like, you are wrong, and I want you to understand you're wrong. And that can be hard. And I'm not saying that it's been easy to take that, but I understand that it is coming. I try to have empathy there and have understanding for the place where it's coming from, right? That this is a person who has been denied authority. And I am a physician. I have MIT and Harvard attached to me, and from Pakistan, a similar, institution, Aga Khan. So there's somebody may have a need to show to the world, I, as a regular human being, have the authority over this seemingly authority to correct her and tell her she is wrong. And that I need to be able to accept that, right? So to somebody, and to be corrected in public by, quote, non-authority, they might find that humiliating. They might find that demeaning. But why is it demeaning, right? All it means is that there may genuinely be a learning need for me, and I need to humbly accept it and thank the person for identifying an opportunity for me to learn, right? And then to your point, Doc Brown, about sort of, I think the last time we talked about this, I had a similar tweak on how you described it, which is that I think even though we as physicians get a little frustrated with Doc Google, and we're probably going to end up with Doc Chat GPT pretty soon.
That's true.
If not already. Reality is that there's such a vastness to the advance of science. And we are busy trying to get our charts written, in EHR, which adds 3 hours to our day. We're trying to, actually talk to patients now, right? And spend time with them and answering messages via the EHR that are, outside of the visit. That it is frankly impossible for no matter how smart or how dedicated or how many honors they got in med school, any doctor or nurse or anybody to keep up with all of the literature. So I do think that we as clinicians have to remember that the patient is obsessed with their disease because they're living it every day. And they may genuinely have more knowledge than we do sometimes, right? So I, for instance, educated my surgeons, albeit I'm a physician myself and blah, blah, blah. But I educated my surgeons that, by the way, did you know that there's a link between migraines and endometriosis? It's an emerging area that I only found out via Twitter, actually, because I was following a researcher who's in the weeds of this advancing edge of science.